Rain and fog swallow Astoria, Oregon. Inside a 2 a.m. diner, a retired German Shepherd K9 named Shadow growls from beneath a table. He's not watching his handler, a broken cop haunted by his past. He's watching a 5-year-old boy, and the sophisticated man holding him captive in plain sight. The boy is silent, rigid, his plate untouched. Beside him, a glass of milk and a silver spoon wait. Behind the man's calm smile is a desperate fugitive's plan to escape. But that spoon is more than just silverware. It is a silent weapon, a desperate message, tapped out in a code only a soldier would recognize. The diner will become a prison, and the parking lot a battlefield. And when Shadow finally moves, one man's hesitation will be the only thing between a child's life and the cold, dark river. What happens next will make you believe in the voice of the voiceless and the loyalty that never truly retires. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from. Drop your country in the comments below. If you believe no child or animal should ever face fear alone, hit subscribe now and share this story with someone who needs hope. The rain came down in cold diagonal sheets, hammering the steel skin of the Astoria-Megler Bridge. In Astoria, Oregon, the weather didn't just arrive, it laid siege. A relentless wind, smelling of deep ocean brine and the diesel-slicked harbor, tore at the town, rattling the windows of the silent Victorian houses clinging to the hillsides. The Columbia River, a vast expanse of churning black water, met the Pacific's fury in a chaotic clash. Tonight, the fog was king. It poured into the streets like a physical entity, a suffocating white shroud that swallowed streetlights whole and reduced the world to the immediate claustrophobic bubble of Kaylin Hayes' truck. Inside the dark blue F-150, parked at an overlook that offered only a view of the swirling void, Kaylin, KL, to the very few he tolerated, stared through the frantic rhythm of the windshield wipers. He was 32, but carried the corrosive weariness of a much older man. His solid, athletic build, honed by years on the police force, was coiled tight with a restless energy that had no outlet. His jaw was rigid, masked by the dark, abrasive stubble of 3 days' neglect. And his green eyes, normally sharp and assessing, were dull, lost in the middle distance. He was a man suspended, not just from the police force, but from his own life. He wasn't alone. In the passenger seat sat Shadow, a 90-pound German Shepherd whose official retirement papers meant nothing to his sense of duty. At 8 years old, his thick black and tan coat was impeccably kept, but the distinguished gray dusting his muzzle and the intelligent whiskey-colored eyes marked him as a veteran. His gaze was fixed on Kyle, an unwavering focus that was both a comfort and an accusation. The dog's body was at parade rest, but his mind was on watch. He could smell the acidic tang of stress rolling off Kyle, see the tension in his hands as they gripped the steering wheel. A low, almost imperceptible whine rumbled in his deep chest before he nudged his cold, damp nose against Kale's arm. Kale flinched, yanked back from the memory that played on a permanent, searing loop, the splintering crack of a door frame, the confusing shouts in a dark hallway, the sudden, brilliant muzzle flash. He saw his partner, Ortega, drop, a dark crimson stain blooming on his chest. 6 months had passed, but the image remained. 6 months since Ortega took 2 bullets that were meant for him, all because Kyle had hesitated, had missed the flicker of movement in an upstairs window. The department had suspended him, citing stress-related inability to perform duties. It was a polite term for broken. The truck's cab, filled with the familiar, earthy scent of wet dog, was suddenly pierced by the harsh buzz of a phone. The screen lit up the darkness. Captain Marcus Riley. Cale ignored it. The buzzing continued, a relentless, angry insect. Shadow lifted his head, ears alert. Finally, Cale snatched the phone. Hayes. His voice was a rough rasp. So you're still breathing? The voice on the other end was pure gravel, cured by 30 years on the force and too many cigarettes. Captain Marcus Riley was a bull of a man, with a thick neck and a face that looked carved from weathered granite. He was Cale's mentor, the man who had personally handed him his badge. That's a start. You missed your check-in. Again. Dr. Evans called me, said you were ghosting her appointments. I'm fine, Cap, Cale lied, the word tasting like rust. Bullshit, Riley snapped, the word cracking with impatience. You're sitting in the dark, torpedoing your own career. Look, I'm not calling to babysit. I'm calling to tell you I pushed the review board. Your suspension is lifted. pending a mandatory psych eval. All you have to do is show up. Talk. That's the deal. Kale's throat tightened. He said nothing. Riley's voice softened, just a fraction. Ortega's in PT. He's walking again, Kyle. He asked for you. That was the blow. Not the order, not the threat, but that. Ortega, the man he had failed, was asking for him. The guilt was a physical weight, threatening to crush his ribs. He's fighting to get back, Riley continued, pressing the advantage. You're just sitting. You're too good a cop to let this bury you. Make the damn appointment. The line clicked dead. Kale stared at the phone. Suspension lifted. It wasn't relief he felt. It was a cold, sharp spike of terror. Going back meant facing Ortega's pity. It meant the whispers, the sideways glances, the knowledge that he had frozen. He hurled the phone onto the passenger side floorboard, a sharp clatter of plastic on the rubber mat. He doesn't get it, Kale whispered, his breathing becoming shallow, the first tremors of a panic attack seizing his chest. The cab felt like it was shrinking, the fog pressing in from all sides. He didn't notice Shadow uncurl himself. He only felt the sudden grounding pressure as the dog maneuvered his large frame into the cramped space, forcing his heavy, noble head onto Kale's thigh. It wasn't a request, it was an order. I am here. Breathe. Kale's hand, slick with a cold sweat, buried itself in the thick fur of Shadow's neck, gripping the familiar worn leather of his collar. The dog didn't move, just leaned in harder, a solid living anchor against the internal storm, absorbing the tremors until Kyle's ragged breaths began to slow. Minutes passed, marked only by the thwack slap of the wipers. The cold had seeped into his bones. He was empty. He was tired of the dark. He owed more to the animal currently pinning him to the seat. He needed light. He needed heat. He needed a place that wasn't this truck, a neutral space where he wasn't a failed cop, just a man getting out of the rain. There was only one place in Astoria open at this hour that served coffee hot enough to scald and food bland enough to be comforting. The Gull's Nest, a 24-hour diner down by the docks. All right, boy, KL said, his voice still rough. He scrubbed a hand over his face. Let's go get warm. Shadow responded with a low thump-thump of his tail against the console. Kyle turned the key. The F-150's engine ignited, and its headlights cut two sharp beams into the oppressive swirling wall of fog. He pulled away from the cliff's edge, steering the truck back toward the faint, scattered lights of the town. The F-150's tires hissed on the rain-slicked asphalt of the diner's parking lot. The neon sign, a stylized green seagull clutching a fish, was a lonely, buzzing beacon against the wet brickwork. The N in Nest was burnt out, making the sign flicker the Gull's Est into the oppressive fog. Kale cut the engine. The sudden silence was immediately consumed by the rhythmic drumming of rain on the truck's roof. All right, boy, let's go. He grabbed Shadow's worn leather leash. Though not technically allowed, Shadow was a recognized retired service animal in Astoria, and the staff at the Gull's Nest prioritized paying customers over obscure health codes, especially at 2 in the morning. The bell above the diner door chimed, a sharp, cheerful sound that felt like a lie against the backdrop of the storm. The warmth hit them instantly, a thick, humid wave smelling of stale coffee, sizzling bacon fat, and the sweet, cloying scent of cherry pie that had been sitting under a heat lamp for hours. The fluorescent lighting was harsh, humming audibly, and casting a sickly greenish tint over the worn linoleum floors. A woman with brassy blonde-dyed hair pulled into a tight, severe bun, glanced up from wiping down the counter. Her name tag, pinned crookedly to her faded pink uniform, read Brenda. She looked to be in her late 50s, with a face full of sharp angles and skin like worn parchment, testament to a lifetime of long shifts and cigarettes. Her eyes, lined with a thick, unforgiving layer of smudged blue eyeliner, widened slightly in recognition. Coil, hell, hun, I haven't seen you in ages. You look like you've been chewed up and spat out, she said, her voice a gravelly rasp. She motioned with her rag. Booth or counter? Coffee's fresh, which means it was brewed about an hour ago. Kyle gave a non-committal grunt. Booth is fine, Bren. He slid into the vinyl-covered seat in the far corner, a spot that was second nature to him. His back was to the wall, offering a clear, unobstructed view of the entrance and the rest of the small dining room. It was a cop habit, ingrained so deep that even on suspension he felt naked without it. Shadow, disciplined as ever, settled under the table with a quiet huff, his body neatly tucked away, instantly alert. Kale scanned the room, Aside from him, only two other tables were occupied. A pair of long-haul truckers, their faces illuminated by the blue light of their phones, sat silently over half-eaten plates of fries. And then, them. Kale's eyes locked onto the occupants of a booth nearer to the front. The man was the first thing Kale's trained eye registered as wrong. He was utterly out of place. In a diner that catered to fishermen and the sleep-deprived, this man looked like he had just stepped out of a high-rise office. He was perhaps 45, with sharp, angular features and pale, smooth skin that seemed untouched by the sun. His dark hair, meticulously combed back, was just beginning to silver. At the temples, he wore a crisp white button-down shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his forearms, revealing a painfully expensive-looking timepiece. His dark wool overcoat, perfectly tailored, was draped over the back of the booth. He wasn't eating. He was watching the small boy opposite him with a chilling, proprietary stillness, like a hawk watching a sparrow. The boy couldn't have been more than 5. He was a whisper of a child, pale and impossibly thin, swallowed by an oversized yellow raincoat that was still damp from the storm. His dark curly hair was plastered to his forehead and cheeks. He sat perfectly rigid, his small hands clasped tightly in his lap, staring down at an untouched glass of milk and a plate with a single dry piece of toast on it. He looked less like a child and more like a porcelain doll, one that had been dropped and hastily glued back together. When his eyes flickered up for a brief, terrified second to scan the room, Kyle saw they were huge and dark, almost black, and utterly vacant of any childish light. They were the eyes of something cornered. Brenda arrived, sliding a heavy white mug onto his table and filling it from the glass pot. "Just the coffee?" Kyle nodded, his gaze still fixed on the man and the boy. "For now." She left the pot, and he wrapped his cold hands around the mug, the heat a dull comfort. He took a sip. It was burnt, bitter, and scalding hot. Perfect. He tried to force the tension from his shoulders, to let the warmth and the white noise of the diner seep in. But something was wrong. Under the table, Shadow wasn't settling. He hadn't relaxed into the loose-limbed sleep of an off-duty dog. He was coiled. Kyle could feel the subtle, high-frequency vibration of the dog's tension through the soles of his boots. A low, deep-chested rumble, too quiet for Brenda or the truckers to hear, resonated from the shepherd. It wasn't an aggressive growl. It was an alert, a deep, canine fixation. Kale reached down, placing a hand on the thick fur of Shadow's neck. "Easy," he whispered, the command automatic. The dog's muscles were rock hard. Kale glanced back at the booth. A father and his son, maybe? A late-night drive, the kid was sick, or tired. That would explain the tension. Kale tried to rationalize it. He was projecting. His own nerves were frayed, shot to hell from Riley's call and the dark thoughts at the Overlook. The dog was just feeding off his stress. "You're seeing ghosts, Hayes. You're not a cop tonight. Drink your coffee." He looked away, forcing himself to study the cracks in the ceiling. But the tension from Shadow was undeniable. The man in the suit pulled out a sleek, modern smartphone. His pale face tightened as he read something on the screen, his thumb tapping out a rapid, angry reply. His focus, previously a laser beam on the child, was now entirely consumed by the device. The boy, Leo, didn't move his head. His eyes remained fixed on his plate, but his right hand, tiny and pale, slowly unclasped from his left. It moved with almost imperceptible slowness toward the spoon lying beside his glass of milk. He gripped it, his knuckles white. Tink. Kyle's head snapped back, the small, sharp sound of metal on glass. Tink. Tink. Thorne didn't look up, his thumb still flying across the screen. Kale watched, his entire body going suddenly, terribly cold. The boy's hand was shaking, but his grip on the spoon was deliberate. Tink, tink, tink. 3 quick taps. Oh! A tight pause. Tink, tink, tink. 3 slower, deliberate taps. Another agonizing pause. Tink, tink, tink. The sound was almost non-existent, buried under the diner's fluorescent hum and the howling wind. But Kale heard it. He saw it. His blood turned to ice. It wasn't a fidget. It wasn't random. It was the oldest, most desperate signal in the book. SOS. The memory of Ortega, bleeding on a dirty floor as Kyle screamed into his radio, flashed in his mind, sharp and brutal. You missed the flicker in the window. He wasn't missing this. The coffee turned to acid in his stomach. Under the table, Shadow's low growl became a fixed, steady vibration. The dog already knew. Kyle looked up, his gaze no longer that of a suspended, broken man. It was the gaze of a cop, and he was looking at a predator. The tink-tink-tink of the spoon was a gunshot in the quiet diner, a sound that sliced through Kyle's apathy and ignited the dormant cop inside him. The world snapped into sharp, unforgiving focus. The hum of the fluorescent lights, the sizzle of the grill in the back, the laughter of the truckers, it all evaporated, replaced by the high-frequency whine of pure adrenaline. His focus narrowed to the man in the suit, the terrified child, and the low, steady growl vibrating from the dog beneath his table. Shadow didn't need a signal. He was already reading the chemical signature of fear and aggression in the air. Kale's heart hammered against his ribs, not with panic, but with a cold, rising tide of purpose. He hadn't just seen the signal, he had felt it. It was a language he knew in his bones. His grandfather, a grim, quiet man who had served 2 tours in Vietnam as a signals corpsman, had taught it to him. He'd spent hours as a child at his grandfather's kitchen table, tapping out codes with a butter knife. "A man who can't talk is a man who can't fight," the old man had rasped, his eyes distant. "This is how you fight when you're gagged." Leo was gagged, and he was fighting. Kale's immediate instinct was to move, to stand up, badge the man, and take the child. But his hand, reaching for the badge that wasn't there, brushed the empty leather slot on his belt. He was suspended. He was a civilian in a tactical jacket. He had no authority, no weapon, and no backup. If he confronted Thorne and was wrong, if it was just a strange, dysfunctional father-son dynamic, his career wouldn't just be over, it would be incinerated. Riley would have his badge for good, and Kale would be facing harassment charges from a man who looked like he had lawyers on retainer. But if he was right, if he let that boy walk out the door... The image of Ortega, pale and bleeding on a dirty linoleum floor, slammed into his consciousness. He remembered the flicker of movement in the upstairs window, the detail he had dismissed, the hesitation that had cost his partner everything. This signal, this tiny, desperate tapping, was his flicker in the window. He would not miss it again. He would not. He needed a plan. He couldn't call 911. The call would be patched to the local Astoria precinct, and by the time they dispatched a car, Thorne would be gone. Worse, if Thorne overheard the call, he would bolt, and the situation would escalate. He needed someone fast, someone quiet, and someone who would trust his word without question. His hand moved under the table, slipping into the deep pocket of his jacket where his phone rested. His thumb scrolled through his contacts, past Captain Riley, past precinct, and stopped on a name he hadn't dared to call in 6 months. Miggs Ortega. His partner. The man who was currently learning to walk again because of him. The man who, according to Riley, had asked for him. The guilt was a physical weight, a stone in his gut. Texting him now felt like the ultimate violation, asking for a favor from the man he had already broken. But Ortega was also the only person in the world who would understand the nuance of this. He would know Kyle wouldn't make this call unless it was real. Kyle needed the license plate. He couldn't see the car from his booth. He had to move. Keeping his movement slow and casual, he slid out of the booth. "Bren," he called out, his voice steady. Brenda looked up from her racing form. "Need a refill. And the restroom?" She nodded toward the back corner. "Coffee's on the counter, hun. Restroom's past the jukebox." This gave him a perfect logical reason to walk across the diner. He grabbed the coffee pot from the burner, moved back toward his table, and deliberately overshot, walking closer to the front windows. He kept his head down, pretending to be focused on not spilling the scalding coffee. Thorne was now speaking into his phone, his voice a low, angry hiss. "Don't care about the market. Just move it. Move it now. I'm 30 minutes out." The child, Leo, hadn't moved. He was staring at the table, his small body rigid. Kyle reached the front window, his back to the room, and paused as if watching the storm. Through the sheet of rain, he saw it. A gleaming black Lexus LS 500. It was completely out of place in this gravel lot, parked nose out for a quick escape. The Oregon plate was illuminated by the flickering neon, 458 TNM. He burned the number into his memory. He turned, topped off his mug, and walked to the back, disappearing into the small, cold restroom. The room smelled of industrial bleach and damp. He leaned against the sink, his hands shaking. He pulled out the phone. His thumb hovered over Ortega's name. He's in PT. He's not on duty. He might be asleep. This is insane. He typed anyway. his thumbs moving with frantic precision. Miggs, I know, I'm sorry. I'm 1023 at the Gull's Nest, code 30, silent abduction. Suspect, male, 40s, high-end suit. Vic, male, 5, dark hair, yellow coat. Suspect vehicle, black Lexus, OR, plate 458 TNM. I'm suspended. I can't call it in. He's hostile. Please, Miggs. The kid, he's scared. He hesitated, then added one more word. Help. He hit send. The delivered notification appeared. He stared at it, the single word feeling like he had just pulled the pin on a grenade. He splashed cold water on his face, the shock of it clearing his head. He looked at his reflection in the cracked mirror. The man looking back wasn't a burnout. His eyes were clear, cold, and focused. He was a cop. Kyle walked back into the diner, the bell on the door chiming as two fishermen, draped in bright orange rain gear, entered, bringing a fresh blast of cold, wet air. The diner was momentarily filled with loud greetings as they stamped their boots. Thorne flinched at the noise, his head snapping toward the door. His eyes scanned the new arrivals, then Kyle, who was calmly sliding back into his booth. Kale met his gaze, held it for a beat, and then casually looked away, as if bored, taking a sip of the bitter coffee. Under the table, he placed a hand on Shadow. The dog was a coiled spring, his low growl now a steady, ominous vibration. Thorne's phone buzzed. He looked down at it, read the message, and his entire demeanor shifted. The controlled anger vanished, replaced by a sudden, urgent anxiety. He typed one last frantic message, then shoved the phone into his pocket. He looked at his expensive watch. He threw a $50 bill onto the table, far too much for the milk and toast. He stood up, grabbing his tailored wool coat. "Let's go," he snapped at the boy, his voice sharp and void of any warmth. He grabbed Leo's thin arm, his grip visibly tight, and pulled the child roughly from the booth. Kael's phone remained dark. His heart sank. Ortega hadn't replied. Thorne was pulling the boy toward the door. Kael was alone. The diner bell's cheerful jingle was a gunshot signaling the start of a race. Thorne was through the door, yanking the small boy in the yellow raincoat stumbling behind him into the maelstrom. The door hissed shut, cutting off the warmth and the smell of stale coffee, plunging Kyle back into the raw, wet cold of the Astoria night. For a paralyzing second, he was frozen. His phone was dark. Ortega hadn't answered. He was suspended, unauthorized, a civilian with a dog. He looked at Brenda, who was already turning back to her racing form, oblivious. The truckers were laughing at some shared joke. No one else had seen the signal. No one else knew. This is it. This is the flicker in the window. You move, or this kid disappears. The thought of that small, tapping hand, of that vacant, terrified gaze, eclipsed his fear of failure. He threw a crumpled $20 bill onto the table, covering his coffee and then some. "Bren," he said, his voice hard. She looked up, startled by his tone. "Call 911, now. Tell them there's a disturbance at the Gull's Nest. Potential abduction. Just do it." Brenda's jaw dropped. "Kyle, what the hell?" He didn't wait for her to process it. "Shadow, higher, here." The shepherd was already on its feet, moving with the silent, fluid grace of a predator. Kale hit the door, the bell jingle-jangling mockingly as he burst back out into the storm. The wind and rain hit him like a physical blow. The parking lot was a chaos of swirling fog and lashing rain, the green neon sign casting grotesque, flickering shadows on the wet asphalt. The black Lexus was 50 feet away, parked nose out, just as he'd noted. Thorne was fumbling with a key fob, his back to the diner, his movements frantic. He was still gripping Leo's arm, pulling the child so hard the boy's feet were barely touching the gravel. Kale's mind raced. He had no authority. He couldn't shout, "Police!" He needed a pretext, a stall, anything to buy time. Time for what? For a miracle? "Hey, sir," Kale shouted over the wind, forcing a note of casual concern into his voice. "Sir, you dropped this." It was a stupid, transparent lie, but it was all he had. Thorne froze. He spun around, his sharp, angular face contorted with a mixture of annoyance and pure, undiluted panic. He saw Coyle approaching, the massive German shepherd at his side, and his eyes, pale and cold, narrowed into slits. He instinctively shoved Leo partly behind his legs, using the small body as a shield. "I didn't drop anything," Thorne hissed, his voice cutting through the storm. "Get away from me. Get that thing away from me." He pointed a shaking, manicured finger at Shadow. The dog, without any command, had stopped, placing himself slightly ahead of Kale. He wasn't growling, but his body was rigid, a 90-pound coiled spring, his head low, his gaze locked on the hand gripping the child's arm. "Just trying to help, man," Kale said, raising his hand slowly, palms out, the universal sign of non-aggression. He kept advancing, one slow step at a time. "Looked like you were having trouble with your tire. Looked flat on the driver's side." Another lie. He was closing the distance. 10 more feet. "It's a bad night for it." Thorne's eyes darted from Kale to the tire and back. He wasn't buying it. He knew exactly what this was. "I know what you're doing," Thorne snarled, his voice a low vibration of rage. "You were watching me in there. You're a cop." It wasn't a question, it was an accusation. "This is a family matter. He's my son. Now, back the hell off before I call the real police and have you arrested for harassment." He was fumbling with the car door handle, his hand slipping on the wet chrome. He was losing his composure, his facade of control shattering. Kale kept his hands up. "Sir, I don't want any trouble, but the boy looks scared. Why don't we just wait here a minute, talk about it?" Just as he said it, his phone, deep in the waterproof pocket of his jacket, vibrated. A single, violent, definitive buzz. Hope, so sharp it was painful, lanced through him. He didn't dare look. His eyes couldn't leave Thorne. "He's tired," Thorne spat, finally getting the car door unlocked. The interior light clicked on, illuminating the plush leather seats. He yanked the door open. "He's sick. We're leaving." He began to force Leo toward the open door. Now or never. Kale took a quick lateral step, cutting off the path to the car door. "I can't let you do that, sir." "You can't what?" Thorne's voice cracked with disbelief. "You have no authority. You're nothing." He shoved Leo forward, intending to bypass Kyle. At that precise moment, Kale, keeping his eyes locked on Thorne, slipped his hand into his pocket and angled the phone screen up. The bright blue light illuminated the rain streaming down his face. One new message, from Miggs Ortega. Kale's breath hitched. He read the text in a fraction of a second. "Plate matches, 4-8 TNM. Stolen 1HR Ago, Portland. Bolo just issued. Child, Leo Vance. Abducted by stepfather, Julian Thorne. Thorne is primary suspect. Federal fraud case. He's running. Cops en route. Kyle. ETA 4 mins. Do not engage. He is dangerous." The information slammed into Kale with the force of a physical blow. Federal suspect. Stolen. Dangerous. This wasn't a bitter custody fight. This was a desperate fugitive. Kyle's entire demeanor shifted. The pleading, placating civilian vanished, and the cop he had been for 12 years took over. His posture straightened, his hands dropped, and his voice, when he spoke, was a new resonant command. "Julian Thorne, let the boy go. Put your hands on the hood of the car." Thorne saw the change. He saw the realization in Kale's eyes, the shift from doubt to certainty. The game was up. Thorne laughed, a short, sharp, ugly sound. "A suspended cop. You're just a ghost, Hayes. You got your partner gutted because you hesitated? You think I don't know who you are?" He knew Kyle's name. The revelation was chilling. This wasn't random. "It's over, Thorne. They're coming for you," Kale said, his voice flat. Shadow, sensing the finality in his handler's tone, emitted a low, guttural growl that was no longer a warning, but a promise. Thorne sneered. 4 minutes is a lifetime, Kale." He yanked Leo back against his chest, clamping a hand over the boy's mouth. With his free hand, he reached inside his tailored wool overcoat. Kale's heart stopped, bracing for the glint of a firearm. But Thorne was faster. There was a sharp, metallic click. A switchblade. The blade, sleek and silver, sprang open, 4 inches of razor-sharp steel catching the flickering green neon from the diner sign. Thorne pressed the flat of the blade against the side of Leo's neck, just under his jaw, pressing into the bright yellow fabric of his raincoat. The boy, silent until now, let out a terrified, muffled whimper. Thorne's pale eyes were electric with a terrifying, calm madness. "You hesitated 6 months ago, Kyle. You flinched. You hesitate now, this boy bleeds out on the asphalt. Back, away, get your mutt, get in your truck, and drive." The world compressed to the 3 feet between KL and the man who held the blade. The rain, the wind, the distant moan of a foghorn, it all ceased to exist. There was only the flicker of the green neon sign on the wet steel of the switchblade. the small, muffled whimper from Leo, and Thorn's voice, a venomous echo in his head. "You hesitate now?" And Kyle was hesitating. He was frozen. His feet were lead, his arms useless. His vision tunneled, superimposing the image of Ortega's blood-soaked vest onto the small, bright yellow of Leo's raincoat. The parking lot in Astoria became the dark, cordite-filled hallway in Portland. He was in the nightmare again, the moment of failure playing out on a loop. His paralysis was so complete, so absolute, that a cruel, knowing smirk twisted Thorn's pale features. He saw it. He had gambled on Kale's trauma, and he had won. "Wrong choice, Hayes," Thorn whispered, and he began to tense, shifting his weight to drag Leo into the car, a predator secure in his victory. But Thorn had miscalculated. He had accounted for the broken man, but he had forgotten about the dog. Under the high-frequency shriek of Kale's own panic, another sound was rising, a low primal vibration that Kale felt in the fillings of his teeth. It was coming from Shadow. The German Shepherd, who had been a statue of coiled potential, was now trembling. His lips, drawn back from his teeth, exposed the white and pink of his gums. His growl was no longer a warning. It was an engine of contained fury. Shadow saw the blade. He saw the child. He saw his handler, his partner, his entire world, paralyzed by a threat he couldn't see. And Shadow made a decision. His training, his breeding, his 8 years of unwavering loyalty, all converged. He was no longer waiting for a command. He was acting. The shift was microscopic, but Kyle saw it. The bunching of Shadow's powerful haunches, the slight drop of his head as he prepared to launch. The dog was going to attack, a suicidal charge against a blade. The realization was a shock of ice water to Kyle's frozen brain. The fear for himself vanished, replaced by a desperate, agonizing fear for his dog. No, not him too. He couldn't lose another partner. The memory of Ortega falling and the pre-image of Shadow being gutted merged into a single, intolerable catastrophe. The paralysis didn't just break, it shattered. In the microsecond before Thorn could move, in the instant before Shadow could launch his own defense, Kale's voice, raw and unfamiliar, split the air. It wasn't a shout. It was a bark of command, sharp, explosive, and absolute. "Shadow! Fast! Grip!" It was the command Shadow had been waiting for. The dog didn't leap. He exploded. He was a 90-pound blur of black and tan, a projectile of focused rage. Thorn, his eyes still locked on Kale's, had no time to react. He was expecting the broken cop to plead, or to fold. He was not expecting the animal. Shadow ignored the knife, ignored the man's chest. He followed his training, targeting the limb that controlled the hostage. His jaws, with a force designed to snap bone, clamped down on Thorn's right forearm, the arm holding Leo's coat. The thud of the impact was audible even over the rain. The dog's teeth sank deep into the expensive wool and the flesh beneath. Thorn roared, a high-pitched scream of pure agonizing shock. His body was violently jerked sideways. His balance was gone. His concentration, his entire world, shattered into a universe of pain radiating from his arm. And for one critical half-second, the hand holding the switchblade wavered, the blade moving a vital 6 inches away from Leo's throat as Thorn instinctively recoiled from the canine assault. Kyle didn't think. He didn't plan. He moved. He was pure, unthinking reflex. The hesitation that had crippled him was gone, burned away by the adrenaline and the loyalty of the animal beside him. He didn't go for Thorn. He didn't go for the knife. He went for the child. He lunged low beneath the arc of the wavering blade and grabbed Leo. His hand, desperate, seized a fistful of the yellow raincoat. He didn't lift the boy. He yanked. Using his own body weight as a counter-anchor, Kyle fell backward onto the wet, gritty asphalt, pulling the small, stunned child clear of Thorn's grasp. He scrambled backward, dragging Leo with him, his boots digging for purchase on the slick pavement until 15 feet of cold, safe distance separated them from the man with the knife. He pulled the boy tight against his chest. Leo was rigid, his small body trembling violently, but he was, for the first time, blessedly silent, his muffled sobs finally choked off by the shock. Thorn was screaming, a string of high-pitched curses, frantically trying to stab Shadow, who was still locked onto his arm. The blade slashed down, catching only Rain. Shadow, a master of his craft, felt the man's balance shift. He released his grip, dodged a wild, silver arc of the blade, and instantly repositioned himself. He became what Kyle had needed all along, a wall. Shadow planted himself, head low, teeth bared, between Thorn and the man on the ground. He was barking now, a deep, concussive, rolling sound that echoed off the brick wall of the diner. It was a sound of absolute control, a terrifying declaration that no one was getting past. Thorn was trapped. He was bleeding. He looked at his car, but Shadow was blocking the path. He looked at Kyle, who was now shielding the silent child. His pale, sophisticated face was a mask of primal fury. The hunter had, in a single, violent instant, become the hunted. He was alone, in the rain, bleeding, with a suspended cop, a silent child, and a German shepherd that was waiting, with terrifying patience, for him to make one more wrong move. Time seemed to fracture. The parking lot, illuminated by the sick green flicker of the diner sign, became a frozen tableau. The man on the ground clutching the child, the bleeding predator with the blade, and the dog, a 90-pound wall of loyalty holding the fragile piece. Kyle's world was reduced to the sound of his own ragged breathing, the deep rolling barks from Shadow, and the steady, agonizing drum of the rain. Thorn was breathing heavily, his pale face slick with a mixture of sweat and rain, his eyes darting between the dog and Kyle, calculating. He was trapped, but the knife still held in his uninjured hand was a stark reminder that he was still deadly. He shifted his weight, his arm clearly agonizing him from Shadow's bite, the dark blood now running freely, staining the sleeve of his expensive white shirt. He was looking for an opening, any opening. He was a cornered animal, which made him the most dangerous thing in the world. Kyle, still on the wet asphalt, tightened his grip on Leo, pulling the boy's small, rigid body flush against his chest. He could feel the child's heart hammering in a frantic, silent terror. 4 minutes, Ortega's text had said. It felt like 4 lifetimes. Then, cutting through the wind, Kyle heard it. A faint, distant sound, almost imagined. Whoop, whoop, whoop. It was a sound that had defined his entire adult life. Sirens. Thorn heard it too. His head snapped up, his eyes wide with a fresh, raw panic. The sound was growing, climbing the hill from the downtown precinct, becoming a desperate wail in the night. "No," Thorn whispered, his voice incredulous. "No, no." He took a step back, his eyes searching for an escape, but there was none. Shadow, hearing the sirens, advanced a single, deliberate step, his barking intensifying, a clear signal that the perimeter was locked. Kay looked at Kyle, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. "You!" he screamed. "You did this!" The world exploded in blue and red light. A black and white Astoria PD patrol car, moving far too fast for the wet conditions, slid into the parking lot, its tires spraying a rooster tail of gravel and water. It fishtailed slightly before stopping, its high beams pinning Thorn in their blinding white glare. The doors flew open. A uniformed officer, young, with a face that was all sharp angles and adrenaline, emerged from the driver's side, his sidearm already drawn and leveled. "Astoria PD, drop the knife, drop it now!" His voice cracked slightly on the command. This was Officer Dempsey, barely a year out of the academy, and this was likely the most violent confrontation he had ever faced. His partner, emerging from the passenger side, was his exact opposite. She was a woman in her late 40s, Officer Miller, with short-cropped, iron-gray hair and a face that looked like it had been carved from the same hard rock as the Astoria coastline. Her movements were economical, her voice a low, authoritative bark that cut through the noise. "Hands! Show me your hands! Drop the weapon!" But Kale's eyes were locked on the second vehicle that slid in right behind the cruiser. It wasn't a patrol car. It was a dark, unmarked sedan, its dashlight flashing. The driver's door opened, and a man emerged, not running, but moving with a pained, furious urgency. He wore jeans and a dark hoodie, the hood slicked back with rain, revealing a sharp, intelligent face Kale would know in hell. He had a pronounced, angry limp, his right leg dragging as he moved. It was Miguel Miggs Ortega. He had his badge on a lanyard around his neck, and in his hand, his service weapon, held with a familiarity that Kale had envied for 6 long months. Ortega took a position of cover behind the open door of the patrol car, his eyes assessing the scene in a fraction of a second. Kyle on the ground, the kid in his arms, the dog, the knife, the blood. His face, thin and drawn from months of agonizing physical therapy, was a mask of pure, cold focus. Trapped in the converging beams of 2 cars, Thorn's arrogance finally shattered. He was surrounded, his escape route cut off, his arm shredded, and a canine waiting to finish the job. Miller advanced, her weapon steady. "On your knees, now! Drop the knife or we will shoot!" Thorne's hand wavered. He looked at the blade, then at the officers, then at the dog. With a guttural roar of frustration, he threw the switchblade. It skittered across the wet asphalt, spinning uselessly under the Lexus. "He attacked me!" Thorne screamed, holding up his bleeding arm. "That's a police officer! He assaulted me! His dog attacked me!" Dempsey moved in, all nervous energy, while Miller, the veteran, holstered her weapon and unclipped her cuffs. "Shut up," she commanded, grabbing Thorne's good arm and spinning him against the side of his car. "You're bleeding on my crime scene." As the cuffs clicked shut, Cale finally let out the breath he hadn't realized he was holding. It felt like his lungs were collapsing. Under his hand, Shadow instantly went silent, but he remained standing, a statue of vigilance, until Cale gave the command. "Shadow, aus, out." The dog huffed, his body finally relaxing from its rigid stance, and he sat, his gaze never leaving Thorne as Dempsey and Miller read the man his rights. The parking lot was suddenly chaotic. Brenda and the two truckers were standing in the diner doorway, their faces pale with shock. Paramedics, who had been staged nearby, were already rolling a gurney across the lot. Kyle was still on the ground. The adrenaline was leaving him, and his hands were shaking so violently he could barely hold the child. Leo, who had been a rigid, silent weight, finally let out a sound, a high-pitched, gulping sob that tore through Kyle's heart. "Kyle." The voice was quiet, right beside him. He looked up. Ortega was standing over him, his face illuminated by the flashing red lights. His dark eyes were filled with a complex mixture of pain, relief, and something Kyle couldn't identify. Kyle tried to speak, but no words came out. He was still the man who had failed. Ortega looked down at Kyle, then at the sobbing child, then at the cuffed Thorne being pushed into the back of Miller's cruiser. He looked back at Kyle, who couldn't meet his gaze, his eyes fixed on the wet asphalt. Ortega took a limping step closer. "He taunted you, didn't he?" Ortega said, his voice low. "He knew who you were. He said you'd hesitate." Kyle nodded, a single jerky movement, shame washing over him. Miggs nodded slowly, his eyes scanning Kyle's face. "But you didn't, Kyle," Ortega said, his voice soft but absolute. "Look at me." Kyle forced his eyes up to meet his partner's. "You didn't hesitate. You saved the kid. You didn't wait for us. You did the job." It was absolution. It was the only voice in the world that could have pulled him from the darkness. A female paramedic, her face calm and kind, knelt beside him. "Sir, we need to check the boy." Kyle nodded, but when he tried to loosen his grip, Leo's small arms, which had been limp, suddenly locked around Kyle's neck with desperate strength. He buried his face in Kyle's jacket, his sobs intensifying. "No, no, no," he whispered, the first words Kyle had ever heard him speak. "It's okay, kid," Kyle said, his own voice breaking. "It's okay. I've got you." He looked at the paramedic. "He won't let go." The paramedic nodded. "Okay, then you're coming with us. Let's get you both in the ambulance." Ortega put a hand on Kyle's shoulder, a firm, grounding pressure. "Go, we got this," he said. "We'll secure the scene. And Kyle?" "Good boy," he said, not to Kyle, but to Shadow, who was watching his handler with worried eyes. As Kyle stood, helped by the paramedic, and carried the clinging child toward the ambulance, he finally, after 6 months, felt the crippling weight lift from his shoulders. The ambulance was a box of harsh, sterile white light, smelling of antiseptic and diesel fumes. Its sirens, now a muted whoop-whoop reserved for intersections, were the only sound punctuation in the steady roar of the engine and the relentless drumming of rain. Cale sat on the narrow bench seat, his back rigid against the wall, his entire body soaked in a mixture of rainwater and parking lot grime. He was a paradox, a suspended officer, covered in filth, sitting in the back of an ambulance, holding the most important piece of evidence in a federal case. Leo was a dead weight in his arms, his small body still rigid, his face buried so deeply in the collar of Kyle's tactical jacket that Cale could feel the child's tiny, shuddering breaths against his skin. The boy hadn't let go. Not when the paramedic, a young, calm woman named Jenna, had tried to check him, and not when they'd lifted Cale onto the bench. Jenna worked around them, her movements practiced and gentle, taking Leo's pulse from his ankle, shining a small penlight into his unresponsive eyes. "He's in shock, but his vitals are stable," she said quietly, more to herself than to Kyle. "No visible physical trauma, thank God." Kyle just nodded, his hand resting protectively on the back of Leo's head, his gaze fixed on the water streaking down the small, fogged window. He wasn't a hero. He was just the man who hadn't let go. They bypassed the hospital, as Leo wasn't injured, and headed directly to the Astoria precinct, a place Kyle had avoided like a plague for 6 months. The ambulance bay was a hive of chaotic, wet activity. As the doors swung open, Kale was hit with the familiar sounds of car doors slamming, radios squawking, and the low, urgent murmur of cops at work. Ortega was already there, leaning heavily against the hood of his sedan, his limp more pronounced under the sodium lights. Shadow was in the back seat, his noble head framed in the window, watching Kyle's every move. As Kyle stepped out, still carrying the child, Captain Marcus Riley emerged from the bay doors. His face, that granite mask of authority, was unreadable. He looked at Kale, at the child, and then at Ortega. He gave a single curt nod. "Hayes, inside. They're waiting for you." The duty sergeant, a man Kale had known for a decade, just stared, his mouth open, as Kyle, suspended, wet, and carrying a child, walked past the front desk and into the secured detective bureau. They were put in the soft room, a small cinder-block office painted an unfortunate shade of pale yellow, furnished with a worn-out couch and a low table covered in children's toys that looked confiscated rather than donated. Kyle sat on the couch. Leo, still silent, finally unhooked his arms from Kale's neck, but immediately scrambled to sit as close as possible, his small back pressed against Kyle's side, his eyes fixed on the door. A moment later, the door opened and she burst in. She was a whirlwind of frantic energy, a woman, in her early 30s with a cascade of wild red-gold curly hair, a mirror of Leo's. Her face was pale, dotted with freckles, and her eyes, wide and green, were frantic with terror. She wore gray pajama bottoms, rubber boots, and a man's trench coat, clearly thrown on in a panic. This was Chloe Vance, Leo's mother. "Oh, God," she breathed, her hand flying to her mouth. "Leo!" She rushed forward, dropping to her knees but stopped a foot away. Leo didn't move. He didn't look at her. He just stared at the wall, his small body beginning to tremble again. Chloe's face crumpled. He won't look at me," she whispered, a sob catching in her throat. "Give him a moment, Ms. Vance." The new voice was calm, clinical, and devoid of warmth. A woman entered behind Chloe. She was in her mid-40s, impeccably dressed in a gray pantsuit, her dark hair pulled into a severe bun. She carried a leather briefcase. This was Dr. R.S. Brandt, the county's on-call child trauma specialist. He's experienced a significant traumatic event. Dissociation is a normal coping mechanism. She turned her professional, assessing gaze on Kyle. "Officer Hayes, is it? I'm going to need the room. You've done well, but your presence is likely a trauma trigger. We need to establish a neutral baseline." Kyle tensed. He was a trauma trigger? He, the man the kid was clinging to? But he was suspended. He had no authority here. He looked at Chloe, at her desperate, pleading eyes, and then at the doctor. "Okay," he said, his voice rough. He started to stand, but as he moved, Leo's hand shot out, his small fingers grabbing a fistful of Kyle's wet jacket. His first word at the station was a choked, desperate whisper. "Don't." Kale froze. Dr. Brandt sighed, a small, impatient sound. "This is not productive. He's formed an acute trauma bond. It needs to be broken gently." She knelt, pulling a small, brightly colored wooden block from her bag. "Leo, my name is Aris. I'm here to help. Can you look at this block for me? It's a pretty blue, isn't it?" Leo didn't respond. He just stared at the wall, his grip on Kale's jacket so tight his knuckles were white. The system was failing. The professional approach was a blank wall. For 10 agonizing minutes, Dr. Brandt tried, her voice never rising, her methods textbook perfect, and Leo receded further and further, until he was just a small, hollow shell. Outside the room, in the hallway, Kyle could see Riley and Ortega watching through the two-way mirror. Ortega, his face tight, pushed open the door. "Doc, this isn't working," he said, his voice flat. Dr. Brandt stood up, her face flushed with professional offense. "Mr. Ortega, this is a delicate process." "It's a delicate failure. Ortega cut in, limping into the room. He's not talking to you. He's not looking at his mom. He's talking to him. He pointed at Kyle. And Kyle, he's not just bonded to you. Ortega turned, walked back to the door, and opened it wide. Shadow, calm. Shadow entered the room, not as a pet, but as an officer. His movements were silent, his ears up, his whiskey-colored eyes assessing the room, the doctor, the crying woman, and finally, the small boy on the couch. He ignored the adults. He walked with a calm, deliberate purpose directly to Leo. He stopped a foot from the couch, sat without being told, and let out a low, soft whine. He nudged his cold, wet nose against Leo's small, clenched fist. Leo, who hadn't moved a muscle for the doctor, flinched. He slowly, agonizingly, turned his head. His vacant, terrified eyes met the calm, intelligent gaze of the German shepherd. The room was utterly silent, broken only by Chloe's quiet sobs. Leo's eyes focused. He was seeing again. His small, trembling hand unclenched. He reached out, his fingers hovering, and then buried his entire hand in the thick, warm fur of Shadow's neck. A single, shuddering breath escaped him. Dr. Brandt looked stunned. Kyle, still seated, felt a profound, aching relief. Leo leaned his head forward, pressing his forehead against the dog's massive, noble head. His lips moved. His voice was a tiny, rusty hinge, a sound barely louder than the rain outside. You're a brave dog, he whispered. It broke the dam. Chloe let out a gasping cry. Kale, his own voice thick, leaned in. He is, Leo. He's the bravest. Just like you. You were so brave tonight. Leo didn't look up, but he spoke again, his voice clearer, his hand still twisting in Shadow's fur. He was mad. Who was mad, Leo? Kale asked softly, his cop brain clicking back online, ignoring the doctor who was now scribbling frantically in her notepad. Mr. Thorne, Leo whispered. He was mad at Mommy. He said Mommy talked to the police. Chloe gasped, her hand covering her mouth. Why did he take you, Leo? Where were you going? Kale asked, his voice gentle. Leo finally looked up, his dark, terrified eyes finding his mother's. He said, we had to go to the boat, the fast boat. He said we were going away forever. He said, Leo's voice cracked, a fresh wave of terror passing over him. He said if Mommy ever told anyone, he would sink the boat and we would go to sleep in the water. It was the final critical piece. Not just abduction, not just running, a premeditated, credible threat. It was the evidence the feds needed to hold Thorne on something far more serious than kidnapping. In the hallway, Ortega, who had been watching, turned to Captain Riley. Riley's stony expression hadn't changed, but his eyes were hard. He looked at Kyle, sitting on the floor, one hand on the boy, the other on his dog. He turned to Ortega. Get his badge. The command, get his badge, hung in the sterile, fluorescent-lit hallway of the Astoria precinct. It was the sound of a key turning in a lock Kale had assumed was rusted shut forever. He was still processing it, his mind a slow-motion replay of the last hour, the tapping spoon, the switchblade, Ortega's text, the fast command. When Ortega himself pushed off the wall, his limp pronounced, his face a mask of pained exhaustion. He gave Kale a look, a complex, silent communication that said everything. I knew you had it. What the hell took you so long? Captain Riley, his granite expression unchanged, turned and led the way to the duty sergeant's desk, a silent order for Kyle to follow. The sergeant, his eyes wide, scrambled to find the property release form. Dr. Brandt had emerged from the soft room, her professional composure completely undone, scribbling frantic notes as she watched Chloe Vance finally hold her son. Leo, exhausted and overwhelmed, had fallen asleep, his small hands still twisted tight in Shadow's thick ruff. The dog a silent, warm guardian at his side. Ortega signed the release, and the sergeant retrieved a small, sealed bag from a lockbox. Inside, gleaming dully under the harsh lights, was Kyle's badge and his service weapon. Ortega didn't hand it to Kale. He held it for a moment, the weight of it familiar in his own hand. Riley, Ortega said, his voice flat. He's still on admin leave, pending the eval. Riley, who was watching Kyle with an unnervingly steady gaze, nodded. That's procedure, Miggs, and he'll follow it. He turned his full attention to Kale. The captain looked, for the first time in Kale's memory, tired. "You're on paid leave, Hayes, effective immediately. Standard procedure after an officer involved, well, whatever the hell that was. Your evaluation is Monday at 0900 with Dr. Evans. You will be there." Kyle just nodded, his throat too tight to speak. Riley sighed, scrubbing a hand over his face. "What you did tonight, it was unorthodox, it was messy, and it was the best damn police work I've seen in this precinct in a year. You didn't just save that boy. You listened. You trusted your instincts over your own fear. You didn't hesitate when it counted." He jabbed a thick finger toward Kale's chest. "That's the cop I trained. Welcome back, Hayes. Don't make me regret this." He turned and walked away, his heavy boots echoing down the empty hall, leaving Kyle and Ortega alone in the sudden ringing silence. Spring came to Astoria not as a gentle promise, but as a hard-won, defiant victory. The relentless, grieving fogs of winter finally released their grip, pulling back to reveal a sky of piercing, improbable blue. The Columbia River, once a black, churning void of despair, was transformed into a glittering, sun-drenched highway, alive with fishing boats and the bright white sails of recreational boaters. The air, scrubbed clean by the long rain, smelled of salt, fresh-cut grass, and the faint, sweet scent of cherry blossoms from the trees lining the waterfront. It was a city reborn. On a bright, cloudless Saturday afternoon, 4 months after that night, Officer Kalen Hayes stood on the grassy hill of Chivoli Park. Not the dark, desolate overlook of his past, but a place teeming with life. He was in his full Astoria PD uniform. The dark tactical jacket was gone, replaced by a crisp navy blue shirt, the creases sharp, the silver badge polished and pinned precisely over his heart. He was clean-shaven, the dark, depressive stubble a memory. His green eyes, no longer dull and haunted, were clear and sharp, scanning the park with a calm, practiced ease. He was standing, not sitting. He was present. Beside him stood Ortega, also in uniform. He was Kyle's new official canine partner. His limp was still there, a permanent physical reminder of that hallway in Portland, but he moved with a fluid, hard-won confidence, the cane long since abandoned. At their feet, Shadow lay in a patch of sunlight, his noble, gray-muzzled head resting on his paws. He was officially retired now, living a life of pampered ease with Kyle, but he still wore a simple leather collar, a small polished tag dangling from it that read, "Shadow's Watch." "Riley actually approved the budget," Kyle said, his voice quiet, watching a group of kids playing soccer. "The city council loved it. Shadow's Watch is officially funded." Ortega let out a low whistle. "I'll be damned. Using retired canines and therapy dogs to sit with child victims during forensic interviews. It's good, Kyle. It's really good. You took that night and built something." Kyle shook his head, reaching down to scratch the German Shepherd's ears. "Shadow built it. He and Leo, I finally paid attention." Ortega clapped him on the shoulder, a solid grounding gesture. "Yeah, well, you're paying attention now." A shout pierced the air, high-pitched and full of unrestrained joy. "Shadow!" Kyle and Ortega turned. Running full tilt across the grass was Leo Vance. He was not the pale, rigid, silent ghost from the diner. This Leo was a vibrant, kinetic burst of energy. His dark, curly hair was a wild mop, his face was lightly tanned, and he was wearing bright red shorts and a flash t-shirt. He was laughing, a loud, beautiful sound that carried across the park. He launched himself at the German Shepherd with the fearlessness of a 5-year-old. Shadow, with a happy woof, rolled onto his back, all 90 pounds of him, submitting to a vigorous belly rub from the small boy. Walking behind him, a small smile on her face, was Chloe Vance. The frantic terror that had defined her was gone, replaced by a steady, quiet calm. Her wild red-gold hair was tied back in a simple ponytail, and she wore jeans and a simple green blouse. She looked peaceful. She joined Kyle and Ortega, her eyes never leaving her son. "He talked about Officer Shadow all week," she said, her voice warm. "He couldn't wait to see him." Kyle smiled. "He looks good, Chloe. He looks happy." "We both are," she said, looking up at Kyle, her green eyes clear and full of a gratitude that needed no words. He's making up for lost time. We both are. She was in counseling. Leo was in play therapy. Thorne facing a mountain of evidence, not least the terrified, whispered testimony of his stepson, had pleaded guilty to federal kidnapping and fraud charges. He was gone, a ghost of the past, as immaterial as the fog that had once choked the city. Kyle, Ortega, and Chloe stood together, a quiet trio, watching the boy and the dog rolling in the grass, a perfect, uncomplicated picture of safety and joy. Kyle looked at his partner, at the woman and child he had saved, and at the dog who had saved him. He turned his gaze from the park to the wide, sparkling expanse of the Columbia River, no longer an abyss of ending, but a horizon of possibility. He was Officer Kalen Hayes, and he was home. Sometimes, a miracle isn't the parting of a sea or a burning bush. Sometimes, a miracle is the smallest cry for help that is finally heard. It's the tap on a glass of milk, the whine of a loyal dog who refuses to give up, and the courage that rises from the ashes of failure. The story of Kyle, Leo, and Shadow reminds us that God always places his guardians in the right place at the right time. He didn't send Kyle an angel with wings. He sent him a four-legged partner who saw his worth even when he couldn't see it in himself. And he placed in Leo's heart the courage to send out a signal of hope. In our everyday lives, we can all be a shadow for someone. We can be the one who listens when others are silent, the one who protects when we see someone vulnerable, and the one who stays when the rest of the world has walked away. Never underestimate the power of a small act of kindness. You never know, your action might be the very signal someone is desperately praying for. If this story touched your heart, if you believe in the power of loyalty and redemption, please share it with those you love. Comment below about the guardian in your own life, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories of hope and quiet miracles. May God bless you all, keep you safe, and always send a loyal guardian when you need one most.